Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Yeah. We are going to go live. We are live now. Ariba, I hand it over to you. Please begin.
Let me, yes. Good afternoon, one and all. Welcome to our 46th event, where we will be discussing a prominent book that is tremendously relevant to our times, To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism by Debashish Roy Chowdhury and Dr. Keane. Association of Indian Research Scholars, as we like to call it, is immensely honored and also delighted to have such an eminent panel for the discussion. One of the authors, Dr. John Keane, joins us today for the discussion along with Dr. Ash Narain Roy and Dr. Niranjan Sahoo. We are also happy to announce that today the chair of the session will be Dr. Balveer Arora. It is indeed a special day. Now I request Evangeline Shaw, the General Secretary at AIRS, to introduce this Association of Indian Research Scholars and the author. Over to you, Evan.
I think Ivan has gone into the backstage somehow. She just messaged me. Could you please, Ariba, could you please add her back?
Yeah, sure. Meanwhile, Zeba, can you begin the introduction to this? I'm attempting to.
Yeah. You can remove. You can put me in the backstage and put Ivan here, and then when I start speaking, you can change that.
I request you to please do the introduction. Sure.
Okay. Just a second.
I can. Okay.
Ivan, are you here?
Okay. I'm here. I can start.
Yeah.
I've just
Please
been
start.
put in the front stage. All right. The Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS, is the brainchild of the President Ariba Asnat Mozam. It was created to bring together like-minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation. It aims to collectively increase the knowledge base through interaction with the best minds in the world. So far in the past, we have been able to have passionate discussions with Professor Joseph Nye, Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Amina Wadud, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Rajan Harshe, and others. The aim of this discussion has been done to provide a platform for young scholars to connect with the experts where they can have stimulating and interactive sessions. In order to make this happen, we host webinars, talks, and book discussions. In the future, we also intend to expand towards doing conferences, symposiums, and book discussion panels in an in-person mode. Through these medium, AIRS intends to promote a seamless and harmonious interaction between the social science and humanities communities in the country and to bring everyone within one ambit. AIRS regularly also releases newspapers that encapsulates in a condensed fashion our work that has been done so far, as well as create spaces where young scholars can broadcast their specific research from time to time. We are available on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram, and we have our own site, which is airs.org.in. And now I will introduce our speaker this moment. Professor John Keane is a professor at the University of Sydney and the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. Well known for his innovative approaches to democracy, he rose to prominence as a theorist and champion of civil society and the democratic opposition in Central Eastern Europe even before the 1989 upheavals. He was a major contributor to the Flying University Apartment seminar program in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. He launched the world's first democracy research institute, the London-based Centre for the Study of Democracy, in the spring of 1989, shortly before the Central Eastern Europe uprisings. He developed and directed the Sydney Democracy Network for the past 10 years. The New York Times, Al Jazeera, the Times Literary Supplement, The Guardian, Harper's, the South China Morning Post, and the Huffington Post have all published his work. His work has been translated into 35 languages. Democracy Field notes his experimental online column in the London, Cambridge, and Melbourne based The Conversation garnered roughly a million readers between 2014 and 2019. His best known works are the award winning and best selling Tom Paine, A Political Life, Violence and Democracy and Media Decadence. And now for our esteemed panel of discussants and chair, I call upon our Vice President Zeba to introduce them. Over to you, Zeba. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evangeline. I'll quickly introduce our two discussants today. Dr. Ash Narain Roy holds a PhD in International Studies from Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University. He spent more than 4 years as a visiting scholar at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City in the early 1980s. From 1990 until 2001, he worked as an assistant editor at his Hindustan Times. In 1997, Dr. Roy was sent by the UN to Cairo and Amman as member of the fact-finding new mission on the question of Palestine. He has published multiple papers in national and international publications on democracy, local government, federalism, globalization, and Indian foreign policy. He has also delivered dozens of presentations at international seminars and conferences. He was a member of the international team to observe the Sri Lankan election in 2015 and was the first Indian changes. Dr. Roy sits on the boards of many institutions and think tanks. He is the author of several books, including Orient Black Swans, Development, Decentralization, and Democracy, which was published in 2015. He is currently the director of Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi. Dr. Niranjan Sahoo is a senior fellow at Observer Research Foundation, a leading think tank in New Delhi. With years of expertise in governance and public policy, Dr. Sahu now leads studies and programs on governance, democracy, electoral reforms, conflicts and insurgencies, and human rights, among others. A recipient of Ford Asia Fellowship in 2009 and Sir Ratan Tata Fellow in 2010, Dr. Sahu currently serves a member of the Carnegie Rising Democracies Network, Washington, D.C. He serves also as the Regional Democracy Expert Advisor to Freedom House USA and Asia Democratic Research Network, Seoul. His forthcoming book is on Funding India's Democracy by Routledge, London. His work on polarization in India, that is titled Hindu Nationalism and Rising Political Polarization in India, was recently published by the Brookings Press, USA. I will just move on and introduce our chair today as well. Dr. Professor is the founder and chairman of the and is a member of the International Association Center uh, uh, for Federal Studies, IACFS. He was earlier professor of political science at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was rector and pro-vice chancellor of the university from 2002 and 2005, responsible for academic affairs. He is currently president of the Board of Water for People India and chairman governing body of the Blind Relief Association College for Special Education. He is the convener of the Programs Committee on Governance of the Indian International Center. Professor Arora obtained his doctorate in political science from the University of Paris, Pantheon-Sorbonne, after studying at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and at Sciences Po Paris. He has been a visiting professor at Sciences Po Paris as well as at universities in Japan, China, and the US. He is a former president of the Alliance Francois de Delhi and founder president of the Sciences Po Alumni Association in India. He was chair of the Governance and Nomination Committee of the Board of the NGO Plan International India 2008 to 2017. He has written extensively on India's federal democracy, its political institutions, and processes over the past 5 decades. He has been a member of the scientific councils of the French Network of Institutions of Advanced Studies and the House of Human Sciences, Paris. He is currently vice president of the Institut International Transcultura in Paris. He is on the Scientific Advisory Council of the journal Communications in Paris and has delivered lectures in several prominent French universities. He was made a knight in the Legion of Honor, the highest civilian honor of the French Republic, in July 2011. Earlier, he was appointed officer in the National Order of Academic Laurels 2002. With this, I conclude the introduction to the speakers and the writer today. I now call upon Professor Arora to take over this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ziba, and thank you for those introductions. It's indeed a pleasure to be with friends, as well as to be in the company of Professor John Keane, who's well known as a specialist on democracy. I noted that he founded an institute for the study of democracy in 1989. And I think that's precisely the moment when it was declared, apart from declaring that it was the end of history, declaring that that was the only game in town. And I think the 30 years that have passed since then have given us a lot of experience on what I might call the democratic condition, how it relates to what we knew about democracy in theory and practice earlier, and how through a political process, the field of concern of democracy enlarged. And various adjectives were invented to describe different types of democracies. The tent was very wide. The minimal condition seemed to be that you hold elections in whatever shape and form, that you have a reasonable transition and transfer of power. But as democracies, the number of democracies grew, so did the interest in the study of the pathology of democracies, because the sample was much larger, the symptoms were different, and even the old comparison between the old democracies and the new democracies sometimes paled into insignificance when you saw that some of the older democracies were having the same problems with their elections and transfer of power that the newer ones have. So I think we are privileged to be able to discuss this book, To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism, that, and I'll ask Professor John Keane to talk about it. To kill involves, what may I say, murder most foul. And who would have thought the old man had so much blood in him? The question of the death of democracy poses the question of whether in life it was vibrant, what were the means it had for resilience, what were the pathologies that developed, and who killed it. I think this discussion is going to be fascinating. We are in the midst of an important election period in India, where the largest state is voting to elect its government, the state of Uttar Pradesh. And it is in this context that I look forward to Professor Keane telling us a bit about his book, and then I'll call on the discussants to share their views thereafter. So, Professor John Keane, the floor is yours. 10, 12 minutes.
Yes, delighted, Professor Arora. Thank you all very much for coming. I do apologize on behalf of my co-author, Debashish Roy Chowdhury, who could not make it tonight. I apologize for him. You have me alone a white guy who has had a long-standing love of India and a long-standing intellectual interest in India and the question of democracy. In just a few minutes, if I may, I'd like to say something in very summary form about the book. It is, first of all, a radical reappraisal of Indian politics and society and the whole question of Indian democracy. Of course, it is indebted to a whole tranche of scholarship going back to the foundational work, for example, of Rajni Kothari, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting several times and discussing at length what became this book. It is also a nod in the direction of, for example, Sunil Kilnani's book, The Idea of India, which for me was a very important book some 20 years ago, for making the case that India had done many things to democracy, to the spirit and substance of democracy. This book is an engagement with that literature. It's also a critique of the thesis, which until quite recently among intellectuals, Indian intellectuals, was the orthodoxy. The thesis that India is on the path or has actually already become a consolidated democracy. That is, for example, the work that's the thesis that you will find in the most recent book of Peter de Souza, for instance. This book has many things to say about those questions. It is an engagement with that literature, and it tries to go beyond that literature. A second big point is that this book is, of course, about India, but it is a contribution to the whole literature of how it is that democracies perish. You have no doubt read Danny Ziblatt's work on this subject. There is also some European work on this subject of how democracies perish. There is a thesis that runs through this book, which, as co-authors, we consider to be something fresh, something old, but something fresh with a great deal of contemporary pertinence. And finally, this book, by way of some generic thoughts, is why it is a book about why it is that democracies and democrats everywhere must fear what is happening in India. That India is no great exception in the contemporary challenges and problematics of democracy. Many lessons can be learned. This book, as it were, uses India as a case study for elaborating a bigger set of concerns that should worry us in these years of the 21st century. The book, if I may just come down from the generic propositions, the book has a number of things to say. It wants to imagine, to conceptualize democracy as a whole way of life. This should be elementary. It should be a fundamental principle of research on democracy, but it isn't. Democracy in so much literature in the last generation has been centrally about elections and parties and parliaments, about governmental institutions. What we say in this book, going back to debates of the 1920s and 30s, is that democracy is a whole way of life, and that unless the social foundations of a democracy are nurtured, then that democracy is in trouble. So descriptively and normatively, the proposition is that democracy is much more than free and fair periodic elections. It's much more than ticking boxes or pressing electronic buttons. It's more even than the public scrutiny of power, what I have called monitory democracy. It's a special kind of social life. It is a political form, ideally, in which there is freedom from hunger, in which there is limited or no humiliation and violence against citizens, in which callous employers are restrained, in which there is the rejection of caste bigotry and religious dogmatism, in which there is respect for women and children, in which there is a right to bio entitlements, so to say, clean air and water, for instance, where there is freedom from fear, where there is rejection of the dogma that things cannot be changed. That's a very important point that Tocqueville first made, I would say, in his Démocratie en Amérique. One of the special features of democracy as a form of life, it's repeated through the course of this book, is that when its spirit takes root in people's lives, it encourages them to see, to feel that things can be changed, that what is not necessary. It's not given by gods or a god, that things can be changed. The book engages what in the early parts refers to as the India story. And we have sympathy for this India story. The India story is that India has become the world's largest democracy. And this tale, this belief, repeated yesterday in Melbourne at a meeting of the Quad member states, this belief is certainly, it contains some truths. India survived partition. It avoided dictatorship. It defied old arrogant Churchill's belief that India was a mere abstraction, that no parliamentary democracy could be founded on a social foundation with multiple faiths and languages and so on. There was no unified sense of nation. It defied that view. India introduced innovations. The whole idea and ideal of secularism is an Indian contribution to thinking about democracy. Secularism not in the sense of the French or the British or the American understandings. It was an experiment in democracy that did astonishing things. In the first general election, as you know, more than 175 million people, men and women, voted for the first time in those 1951-52 elections. And what we say is that these achievements have helped sustain the India story, that India is the world's largest democracy. But paradoxically, and rather ironically, outside support has been vital, particularly from the Americans. There has been a sustained, for some decades now, diplomatic love affair after the collapse of the Soviet Union in particular, between the United States and India, culminating in events such as the Narendra Modi Stadium meeting of Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump. And of course, India also defeated emergency rule. So this India story points to the narrative that India is the world's largest democracy. What we say in this book, actually, is that India is the world's largest failing democracy. And it is failing because of one further point, because India, the case of India teaches us that there are other ways in which democracies can wither and perish. The book does not predict that outcome, but it worries its head about it, and it encourages readers to ponder this. How do democracies die? Well, there is a common view in the literature on democracy that it is principally through military coup d'etat that democracies are killed, sudden death. Morsi's deposition in Egypt, Yingluck Shinawat in 2014 in Thailand, Bolivia, the Bolivian government in 2019, Allende under Chile under Allende. I mean, these are much written about and often thought to be the principal threat to democracies. Well, what we say is that democide can happen slowly. It can happen when the social foundations of a polity called a democracy, committed to democracy, when the social foundations are neglected. And so the middle part of the book is a documenting with data, with field work, most of which was conducted by my co-author, Roy Chowdhury, that shows, for example, that this is a democracy in which, for instance, the richest 1% of the population owns 4 times the total wealth of the bottom 70%, some 950 million Indian citizens. It shows disturbing data such as in Delhi, only 1% of Delhi households say that they are never worried when a female member of the household is out alone day or night. It is a democracy in which 40%, the statistics show, of young people are in not gainful employment. And what we try to show towards the end part of the book is the connection between this social decay, this neglect of social foundations, which is not Modi's doing. It has been developing actually from independence. What we show is that this degradation, this fragmentation and degradation of social life has pathological political effects. For instance, when this kind of social decay and growing inequality, bigotry, and so on, humiliation happens, then the high legal ideals of the Constitution are undermined. Legal powerlessness grows, a sense of cynicism. The judiciary becomes vulnerable to political meddling and to state control. Or take another example of this connection between the social and political. When poor diet, when poisonous air, when contaminated water is the fate of millions of people, this maims and kills citizens. This is a direct violation of the norms of democratic integrity and dignity. When fear of violence, rotten healthcare happen, when they spread, then people's lives are, of course, subject to a kind of arbitrary power. And it is these dynamics, so we try to say in the book, which is the breeding ground of demagogues. And demagogues, it's a topic I hope we can discuss, are an old autoimmune disease of every known form of democracy. It's happening also in India. Demagogues who raise hopes, who criticize political establishments, who appeal for votes, who promise as redeemers that things will become better, that the nation will grow stronger. This kind of demagoguery is alive and well and flourishing in India, and it is, as we see it, a direct threat to democracy. I would like, perhaps in Q&A, to talk about this dynamic, this social decadence, and the rise of demagoguery, and the way that it can lead to despotism. I have no time. I think I should stop, Dr. Arora. I think I should stop here, but I wanted to say just one final thought about the question of hope in this book. It may have occurred to you that the title of this book is actually borrowed in part from a famous 1960 novel by Harper Lee, a Southern Gothic novel in the United States. It is one of the classic novels of that country. And in that novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, there is, of course, hope. There is a lawyer who stands up to racial bigotry and to discrimination against women. It is, in a way, a hopeful novel. It is it's a tale of courage, of denial, of arbitrary power. And we took this title and amended it to Kill a Democracy, because according to the last few pages of this book, and on this I end, democracies breed hope. That's a philosophical thought. Democracies, to repeat, encourage citizens to sense that their conditions of life are contingent, that things can be changed. Mutinies happen daily in India. On social media, for instance, there is voter resistance. The strength of support for the BJP should not be exaggerated. 37% of the electorate voted for the BJP in 2019. There are, of course, regional dynamics in this at least federal system that complicate any transition to a kind of centralized, concentrated form of power in the name of the people, which we call despotism. There is, it's obvious, a plurality of languages, of ethnicities, of caste and class divisions. There is a sense, we say in the book, that women are claiming their dignity increasingly. This is clear, for instance, in the refusal of the sanitary napkins tax in 2018. And there is a major conflict, as you know, that has been going on in Karnataka in recent weeks. The spirit of Satyagraha is not dead. There is a very fine constitution that Aishwari Kumar and others have pointed out remains a touchstone for how democracy could become. So the transition to a concentrated form of power with a strong measure of public support, which we call despotism, that transition is by no means completed. And it is one of the great political and scholarly questions, we say in this book, that has a global resonance, that the world should pay attention to India, because these dynamics are of fundamental importance to the future of democracy on our planet. But on this point, I think, Dr. Arora, I should stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keane. This is, I think you've outlined with great lucidity the importance of drawing the right conclusions from this experiment, as you call it, in democracy, and the leap of faith, as it were, that democracy can be built on foundations which did not at all correspond to the stages of development of democracy in the rest of the world, notably the illiteracy, poverty, and so on. And then the question of the political culture that democracy requires. I think your diagnosis as well as your prognosis are very encouraging, very promising, because it is through this process that one imagines, not only one reads one's past, but I'm referring, for example, to the Italian semiologist Umberto Eco. 1995, 5 years after this triumph of democracy, he was pointing out from his own experience 14 characteristics to watch out for when democracies were sliding towards fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Fascism is, this is why I bring this up, is that are we to imagine the alternatives of democracy in the ways in which democracy slid in various directions: autocracy, despotism, national populism, the weakening of institutions, the weakening of intermediary representative institutions, and the uh, establishment, you rightly called it demagogues, of a direct link between the people and the leader, which made him the sole articulator of what the people wanted, and all other institutions, the media, civil society, elected representatives, then pale into insignificance. I think you've raised some very important issues, and these are things that we do worry about, and I think we'll come back to some of them. But I'd like to now request Dr. Ash Narain Roy to come in with his remarks.
Thank you, Professor Arora. Let me also thank AS for the invitation to share some of my thoughts on this important book. There are times when asking questions is perhaps more useful than offering answers. And I think that time is now. If ever there was a moment when political scientists and democracy lovers needed to ask tough questions, it is also now. A writer's job, to my mind, is to ask tough questions, to make the invisible more visible, and make the unheard more unheard. Debashish Roy Chowdhury and Professor John Keane have done precisely that. When we navigate the contemporary democratic landscape, we realize that the traditional compass point of democracy have practically disappeared. Democracy's interlocutory potential too is waning. Democracy suffers from two excesses: the aristocracy of those who govern, or the contempt of the people for the authorities which they have themselves established. What we are witnessing across the world is some kind of a zombie nationalism. The bedrock of healthy democracy is getting eroded everywhere. And there is a widespread sense of pessimism. Let's accept the fact. Because democracy is being killed in the name of democracy. And that is happening in the global north, as well as Professor Keane has told. Coming to the India story, the past seems to be another country in Rome, Athens, and Cairo, But nowhere is the disconnect so absolute as in India's downhill journey. The book, to my mind, is a hard-hitting portrayal of that downhill journey. It also catalogs manifold failures and challenges. In the 21st century, democracy is wiped out, as he pointed out rightly, not by tanks overrunning parliament, but democracy dies because good people seem to be indifferent and the weak people seem to surrender. Democracy seems to have expanded, but has it actually deepened? Let me say a few points with regard to federalism. Federalism was never India's greatest strength, and yet it had never faced the kind of attacks that it has now. It seems to be, it is no more a moat against despotism. What we have today is ramshackle federalism. Institutions do not defend themselves. Indian democracy today suffers not just from institutional paralysis, but also institutional silence. There is definitely a change in the institutional landscape. To these, I must add a paralysis of imagination. Of course, the authors have used a better word, institutional vandalism, that it has witnessed. It's not enough to create institutional architecture. Democracy and federalism need institutional gardening and institutional plumbing. The authors offer a compelling explanation of India's democratic erosion. As they have said, how India kept the flag of democracy aloft at a time of rising dictatorship all across Africa and Latin America and India. In fact, columnist Bernard Levine, who was writing for London Economist, was in Delhi in the 1990s, and I heard his speech in Delhi. He said, if democracy in India fails, the end of democracy itself will be in sight. But that was the kind of encomiums that Indian democracy received. In that context, it is very alarming to say the kind of degeneration that we see democracy facing across the world as well as in India. The authors further maintain how India was a laboratory featuring a first ever experiment in creating national unity, economic growth, religious tolerance, and the like. I also agree with their contention that political institution building during the initial years were kind of, fairly substantial. And this is where I will have a couple of questions. I just come to that. They have possibly said fairly good and positive things about the Indian local government, particularly referring to the 73rd and 74th amendments, which they have described as gravity-defying adventure with democratic politics, as it extended democracy, to quote them, downwards and sidewards. It also helped democratize Indian democracy. My point is that that story seems to be adding differently. The panchayats were envisaged as institutions of self-government. Today, it seems to have become merely implementing agencies of federal government's various developmental schemes. Corruption, of course, is also very much rife. And that reminds me of the work of Hannah Arendt, who said, Well, the most radical revolutionary becomes the conservative the day after the revolution. So I think that seems to be the story of Indian Panchayat, but there is hope. Coming to the demo side, they maintain how, and I love that expression, how the butterfly of democracy has become the caterpillar of despotism. They also contend that massive social injustices threaten India's old story. Fully agree. But my point is, how did India succeed in the early years of independence? You had massive illiteracy, massive social degeneration, and yet it happened. Similarly, how is it that democracy in Europe too is failing and falling despite social parameters being fairly good? And this is something that we also need to reflect. A few lines about secularism. Secularism has been systematically disparaged. The authors argue that Muslims have been portrayed as the dangerous other. The hardest part of being Muslim today is, as someone recently portrayed, that neither the state nor civil society gives you the benefit of doubt.
Mm.
I also remember what Professor Arjun Appadurai said, that he talked of two elements. He'd call it twin parameters of predatory identities and the fear of small numbers. This is very relevant what is happening today, because all majoritarian identities are primarily predatory identities. I'm very happy that a very good effort has been made to define what is happening here. As they say, that is not old-fashioned tyranny that we see. It's not old totalitarian. It's a new type of strong state led by a demagogue and run by state and corporate oligarchs. And but is the situation hopeless? Of course, they have said there is a glimmer of hope, and we hope that India proves the prophets of doom of like it did prove them wrong in the past. But there are this time seems to be far more challenging. Let me conclude by saying a couple of things. I must compliment the sharp eyes and even sharper pen of both the authors for capturing the perverse and dangerous effects of democracy's downhill journey. However, I have some reservations with regard to a few conclusions. In one place, the authors have said that, and I think let me see where it is, about how even Xi Jinping seems to have some rivals, but not Mr. Modi in his BJP. I think it's little too harsh, and maybe they will tell us how to. I will say democracy is also becoming a victim of intellectual laziness.
Right.
This is where I think John Keane and Roy Chowdhury have proved that intellectuals will have to take up the burden, because it's also for the political scientists and intellectuals to contribute to reimagine, as has been said. So I think on that note, let me raise a question that Helen Landmore, she's in, I think, Yale University, she raised, and I would love the answer from Professor Keane. She says, well, if democracy is for the people, why can't the people do the governing? And I think that is very relevant question. So
Right.
on that note, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Roy. That was, I think you've added to the vocabulary of not just multi-level federalism by pointing to the intentions of self-rule of the third tier of government, but to the adjective ramshackle federalism. I think that I retain because it was quasi, it was all sorts of things. Uh, and if I may take a minute before I ask Niranjan to intervene, uh, opposition in democracies and opposition in federal democracies need to be considered somewhat differently. And to put it in a nutshell, while opposition in most democracies is a government and opposition in parliament, opposition in federal democracies are spread across the polity and uh, exist at different levels with different intensity and with different effects. So, however unorthodox the federal model that India has might be, I would urge that there is an opposition which uh, is can be quantified in a different set of numbers if you look at it as a regionally dispersed and diverse democracy. Anyway, that's a point that Ash Narain and I can continue because we have that the Center for Multi-Level Federalism in the institute of which he's a director. So if he thinks federalism is ramshackled, I have to really get worried. And Dr. Niranjan Sahoo, the floor is yours. Please come in. You have to unmute.
Thank you, sir. I was actually expecting your intervention the moment I heard the ramshackle federalism, but that's probably another needs another session. In fact, what Dr. Ash Narain Roy raised, actually, I think there are certain bases. But now coming back to the main theme of the discussion, I think let me first compliment Ariba for putting up this book discussion, despite all the troubles. She has been trying to find a common date, and then she fell ill, and with all the troubles she put off, and this is a very relevant topic to debate. And Professor Keane also, John Keane finding also his time despite his schedule. We missed, Debashish, of course, because I've been following his prolific writings on this topic. And I must also say that, I've been also following Professor Keane's, writing, and I've read that book, New Despotism, which, and some of his work on political theory. So it's an honor, actually, to be listening to him and commenting on his work. I think the book, what Professor Arora said and Dr. Ray said, is a I would say very, very incredible kind of detailing of what are the developments. Especially, I like the social side of democracy. That's one area which is not getting adequate attention, and in this book actually does a great service in flagging some of those issues. Health, education, we just look at it as just mere public policy issues, as a kind of failure in governance, we think, but that is so much linked with your day-to-day democracy, and the way citizens interact with the state. I think the larger point that you wanted to get on this book has been very handily addressed. I think I would say that 13 chapter could be 13 great papers, policy papers, because I see the amount of data and amount of information gathering, even anecdotal evidence that you have got a lot of day-to-day stories, and a lot of them around this last 2 years pandemic. I think the link with the larger social and economic and political issues and then the problem in democracy, in the way state approaches its citizens and their issues. I think a lot of them have been very well handled. So I actually, in fact, will not say much about the democide part, which is of course very critical. Covering issues like elections, and then how issues about money, the role of especially the freebies, and then the crucial issue of electoral bonds, which you have raised, on which I have actually written a number of papers in the last couple of years. So I think, and then of course the justice, that at the heart of much of the trouble that we have today is about checks and balances, is about that word you have put is a compliant kind of judiciary. I would say that it's not a compliant judiciary. I would say it's like we have moved much more. Probably we have become an executive judiciary, which is very unfortunate. That in 90% of cases, like what very recently, Indian Express brought out, several major cases in which, predictably you can see which side the judiciary takes. Actually, it's with the state. Actually, on some of those, fundamental rights issues, rights of, delayed this thing, habeas corpus. People been put in the behind the bar for years. Actually, even without any, filing of sort of investigation reports. So on numerous issues which are core to the democratic system have been violated brazenly, and then the judiciary looks and other way. So I think those issues have been very well handled, and including media, of course. From independent media, at least I wouldn't say that in India we ever had a kind of independent media per se. There was at least some bit of autonomy and independence, but it was never fully. But I think that has completely changed, with some exception. From it has become more like a lapdog, actually, which the word you have used is correct, actually. And in India, we popularly call Godi media now, which is a kind of very popular in the social media. So that's actually I think very well handled. But I think my real actually comment would be on the social side of democracy, because this is something I'm actually of late taking a lot of interest, because this is where I think we have actually in last 70 years we have missed the road. Actually, we have not really addressed the issues that even today, after 75 years of independence, we are still talking about the caste discrimination, casteism, that kind of graded inequalities which you have put is actually still remains a major concern, and which is the same, actually, which you have brought out from some of those examples. And then the issue of health, education, and you brought about that labor rights issues, about environmental degradation, polluted air, polluted toxic water, and some of those issues actually that hardly gets attention, unless it becomes like Delhi every year, at least for 2 months we get that attention during the month of November, December, when the real air pollution starts thickening, and especially it hits everybody, because there you can't actually even the richest of the rich also cannot escape. So that actually brings some amount of discussion. So I think those issues have been handled very, very comprehensively, and I think this would actually raise pertinent issues about not only state failure, but failure of here we all the time say just by the bureaucracy, the officials who are the one who are uh, uh, responsible for delivering those services, and ensuring that the targeted group gets it. But we don't really question the elected representatives, the executives, and then of course the lawmakers who I think which you have handled in the other sections about the parliament sessions. The legislative sessions are the sittings time and other things getting reduced over the years, which reflects very poorly about our state of democracy, in fact. And whatever we have is basically elected executive, which actually calls the shot on everything. So the legislature, the parliament, the assemblies have been reduced to just talk shows. I would say very harsh word, but they have become actually talk shows. Once in a while, people realize that those institutions exist. That's the unfortunate day. My couple of just comments I would add actually here. The book where I think even while discussing the social democracy side, I think the book probably the authors I think probably also need to pay a little more attention to also highlight. I think we definitely have missed a lot actually, and a lot of issues still remain. There are still burning issues; they have not been addressed. I think we still have made huge progress also for a country of our size and diversity, as you have rightly claimed. Just look at in terms of social inclusion and political participations. I think this has largely whatever progress we have made has largely come through democratic means, through democratic forum. You look at for a country like a state like Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the socially most hierarchical, kind of state where the Dalits and the lower caste have been treated very savagely, and they have been just treated like as if their life doesn't have any existence of the thing, and they are also women in a kind of feudal society. Their position is even in much more inferior, but there the democratic process, the democratic system created a space for someone like Mayawati to rise. She's not only a Dalit, she's also a woman from the same Dalit community, and she could rise to become several times chief minister. And so I'm saying that's a transformation, social transformation, which has happened. I would say that is also facing trouble today, but I think there have been so much of progress have been made. Dalit have really not been the same Dalit 50 years back they used to be. Just tokenism and symbolism. I think many of them are asserting. You see also even after Mayawati goes, there are more Dalits, aspirants who are coming up. Same thing is also happening, even in much more aggression about the OBC. OBCs also face the similar kind of thing. Maybe they're much better off than the Dalits, but those intermediate caste also face the onslaught of the discrimination from the upper caste. They could be Brahmin, they could be Thakurs, those castes today. Even UP's election, this is one of the major issue today. So I'm saying many of those things have actually been possible. Also, these are also social side of democracy. And then the another aspect which I thought the book probably would have addressed is something what I feel. Now let's when we talk about the rising populism, demagoguery, this sort of nationalist populism all over the world, we are seeing that's not a just India specific trend, but all over the world. Even in most of the developed democracy, you have that phenomena which is creating a lot of trouble. I think to a great extent that is also a function of several things: economic decline, the technology part, that emergence of technology. That technology has changed the complete, that conversation we used to have, that sort of between the state and the citizens and the electorate and the elected. That actually has dramatically changed. Today, if you have someone, has the control over the, those tech, those social media platform, what we are witnessing in India and in many other parts, that gentleman, who is a demagogue or populist leader, it could be Trump, it could be Modi, or it could be Bolsonaro. He's able to bypass all other intermediaries. He's just about to reach the citizen straight away. And in a sense, you can create a kind of plebiscitary kind of politics. So India's politics has also become presidential. In a parliamentary system is largely also function of the latest tool available for them. So I think the amount of misinformation peddled, that is largely possible also because of this technology. Because you have now cheap data, you have a smartphone connection with every average citizen has in last 10 years, and that has actually given them that ample opportunity. So I think this also need to be captured when we talk about where the democracy is heading, because technology and democracy interface is actually poses, I think, the greatest threat and greatest challenge. Unless that is handily addressed in some way or other, I think many of those things we will be talking about social democracy, other thing, but a populist, a national leader can use religion, can use identity, can use any kind of amount and just organize the people on based on his sort of fancy. So where are we actually heading in that case actually? Whether we can, the solution that you have provided, because that is where the solution, that hopes you have provided would not really actually stop because we have seen in India that consolidation based on, in such a plural, diverse society, that what we call Hindu consolidations in Uttar Pradesh and several other states was possible today. People know, they have all the information, other thing, but then the supreme leader or somebody can actually use technology, use misinformation and all kind of social and religious sort of feelings or emotion to create a voting bloc, and that has been successfully done, and that actually is a serious threat. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think these are very important issues. I was wanting to turn to Professor Keane to quickly react to some of the issues that have been raised so far, and then ask Ariba if will be time for us to take a few questions. But John Keane, if you would like to say something about the remarks by the discussants made so far.
Yes, I'd be delighted. Thank you to you both for highly intelligent, wise, careful commentaries. I expected much tougher criticisms. Perhaps that will come out in the conversation. Very briefly, to Dr. Ash Narain Roy, an elementary point that runs through this book is Ambedkar's point. Nobody has mentioned Dr. Ambedkar, which is his warning, as you know, at the time of independence and in the very early 1950s, that if this constitutional democracy, this post-colonial democracy with free and fair elections, if India does not develop the social entitlements of its citizens, then it will surely fail. And it will fail. It's a point he learned from John Dewey, one of his teachers. It will fail because it will rob the life from many millions of citizens. They will not have the power to live dignified lives and to fully participate in elections and to enjoy their constitutional entitlements. It's a very elementary point. My own teacher, C.B. Macpherson, who studied with Harold Lasky, it was also that whole notion of democracy as a whole way of life. And if it neglects its social foundations, if it fails to develop welfare state institutions, then it is imperiled. Also, I wanted to say briefly, Dr. Ash Narain Roy, you are right about this book not predicting autocracy, tyranny, totalitarianism. There was a mention of Umberto Eco. One of the points that my co-author and I discussed at great length is the question of fascism. My own view is very clear. I think what we're witnessing in India, I mean, if you call it fascist, it's a word that still has a sting in its tail, but it's a misdescription of dynamics. What is going on in India is not a politics of mass rallies, of a circulation of secret police, of a single ideology, and a permanent mobilization and the spreading of total fear through the population. I mean, in the strict sense, this is what the category of totalitarianism has meant. And one can read Hannah Arendt and many others on that. Something new bedevils actually existing democracies today. And in the book that has been mentioned, The New Despotism, I tried to say, picking up an idea of Tocqueville. Tocqueville said in Démocratie en Amérique, the one dynamic that democracy should fear is despotism. And by that, he meant that democracy could be destroyed in the name of democracy. It could be destroyed in the name of a strong state and a demagogue who accumulates followers. And those followers believe in the Redeemer demagogue, the savior, the one who offers hope, who offers stability and order and protection and greatness. Despotism is not, if I am right, is a threat to India. And in this respect, the book makes hints about what has happened in Turkey, what has happened in Hungary in the last decade, what happened throughout the Central Asian republics. It's a thesis that I expressed in a piece in the Indian Express, and I urge you to have a look at that. One last remark, Dr. Ash Narain Roy, about Ellen Landemore, who happens to be a colleague of and friend of mine. If democracy is for the people, why can't people do the governing? Well, here you raise a very big set of questions about the historical period in which we're living. There are intellectuals, democratically minded around various parts of the planet, who yearn for a return, I would say, to the ancient assembly democracy model of Athens. You know, they think that democracy ought to be face-to-face assemblies. It ought to be deliberative. It ought to be searching for rationality, etc., etc. I have sympathy for this, but it seems to me that it misunderstands what has happened to democracy in my lifetime. And to put it very simply in just one or two sentences, elsewhere I have described, including in a new book just published called The Shortest History of Democracy, I outline 3 phases of democracy. Once upon a time, there was assembly democracy. Hélène Landemore has sympathies for that. Then came electoral democracy, long story, sometimes called representative democracy, where elections come to be the centerpiece of democracy. The Greeks knew not even the word representation. They had no multi-party systems. They did not hold periodic elections. Something like a reimagining of democracy took place. Long story, and it began to crystallize at the end of the 18th century and through the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. India carried on that tradition, but electoral democracies were almost destroyed in the 20s and 30s. 11 electoral democracies were left on the face of the earth in 1941. My thesis is that India is an example of a transformation of the democratic imagination, the building of all kinds of new institutions, where democracy comes to mean nothing less than free and fair elections, but something more. And that something much more, I call it monitory democracy, is a form of democracy in which flanking watchdog institutions, independent courts, uncorrupted electoral commissions, civil society watchdogs, think tanks, institutes of social science, etc., play a role in monitoring, publicly scrutinizing power. So this is all too simply put. But what I want to say is that with Hélène Landemore and the deliberative democratic school, there is, I would say, they miss this historic transformation that began in the 1940s, where there was a reconsideration across the political spectrum. Ambedkar was one of them, who understood that elections could no longer be the centerpiece of democracy. in no small measure because of the problem of Hitler, that it was possible to use elections to build a new kind of post-democratic future in the name of the people, and that therefore there was a need for check and balance institutions, federal arrangements, for instance, and certainly independent courts. What the despots of our time are doing is that they are doing everything to dismantle those public monitoring check and balance bodies. So Erdogan attacks the juristocracy. Orban in Hungary has managed to effectively destroy the independent judiciary. He's tamed the civil service. The police are on his side. The army keep out of affairs. And he cultivates a whole coterie of journalists who are loyal. When that process happens, and yet there are still ongoing elections, then that polity can easily degenerate very quickly. It takes only 10 years. In the case of Hungary, it can degenerate into a despotism where there is a strong government whose leaders speak the people, who talk about democracy all the time, but the heart and soul of democracy have been destroyed. That seems to me to be a grave danger that confronts India in these times. To Dr. Niranjan Sahoo, there are again, thank you very much for very generous and insightful remarks. I think I agree very much with your two end remarks about the way that the spirit of democracy in India took root, and it has had unfinished transformative effects. You gave the examples of Dalits and OBCs. You gave the example of Mayawati, for example. And you are right about this, and that is a theme that runs through the book. It's, to repeat, and I would say it's Tocqueville who first puts this idea on the table when he spoke about the modern democratic revolution. His thesis is that when the spirit of equalization of power and dignity and life chances takes root, it becomes harder for the powers that be, whether in households or at the state level, to justify inequalities of power. Tocqueville gave the example of discrimination against women, the hierarchy between men and women, and remarked that this would not survive the democratic revolution, because if a democracy is a polity in which people are considered as equals, then how is it that half the population is considered inferior? And he made the same remarks about the problem of slavery. That dynamic, that unfinished dynamic is, I think, first well analyzed by Tocqueville, in which he points out that there is a certain infectiousness of the democratic spirit, that it encourages people to ask, why is it that my life chances are inferior to those of others? How is this? How did this happen? That's the sense in which democracy is a friend of contingency. And finally, about populism and media in particular, well, elsewhere, there is a lot on media in our book, but elsewhere I've tried to write lots about the connection between communications systems and democracy. And yes, it's the case that there is a history of the dynamic that you point out. Think of it like this, and I stop on this point. In the three historical phases of democracy, as I write about them, there are three different, as it were, interlocking modes of communication. In the ancient assembly democracies, the main medium of communication was orality, speech, public speech. And yes, it was complemented with writing, messages, laws on stone, and there were donkeys and horses used to transmit messages. But the primary medium is orality, public speech. The age of electoral democracy or representative democracy, of course, orality continues. People talk. But it is a form of democracy that is mediated by the printing press, so that the book and the pamphlet, the daily newspaper, the letter, the novel come to be the media through which elections are conducted and people live their lives. And it's not accidental that electoral democracy is nearly killed off by the coming of radio and later television. And it's Mussolini and Hitler who understand that the microphone and the radio are means of communication that can be used to destroy democracy. It's more complicated, of course. I would say that this age of monitory democracy, rowdy, noisy, rough and tumble, exposures of Pegasus-type scandals, is a form of democracy in which democracy means nothing less than free and fair elections, but something much more, the permanent public scrutiny of power, is a form of democracy that is entangled with this unfinished digital network communications revolution. And yes, it has its dark side. Surveillance capitalism is Shoshana Zuboff's term. You know about the significance of the Israeli company and its employment to spy upon a whole range of public figures. And yet, precisely because the tools of communication are widely available, that information can be copied, spread cheaply across vast distances in zero time, exactly because of that, what I call in my work digital mutinies can happen. They happen daily. And you cannot understand, for example, the farmers' protests or protests of women against discrimination, the resistance of Muslims in India. You cannot understand that without understanding, of course, this empowerment effect of digital network communications media. So it's a complicated dynamic, and it is a very basic factor, no doubt, to be taken into account to gauge the future of democracy. I would say one sentence. Despite the BBC model, and despite the American commercial radio model, Mussolini and Hitler showed that it was possible to nationalize and to have state centralized control of electronic broadcasting media. That fantasy has become much harder for despots. Ask Xi Jinping. Where almost every day in China, as I know from my research, and I've supervised quite a number of doctorates, and I'm writing a book about China, a new book about China. Every day there is some kind of rumpus that happens. Total control becomes much more difficult under these media conditions, I would say. But thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing other comments, questions, criticisms. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. And I think the question of digital mutinies and with what we have at the same time, Pegasus at the same time, the means of monitoring and trying to stifle dissent, but it keeps coming up. That's all part of the inner resources and resilience of democracies that are available now, which may not have existed in the past. And I think thank you for bringing that in and concluding on that optimistic note. So I would now at this stage thank the organizers for having asked me to conduct this discussion and turn to them for the rest of the program where they may have questions to be answered by Professor Keane.
Thank you so much, Professor Arora. There are a few questions that the audience have asked. Professor Arora, may I ask you to help me out here, where you could read the question out, and I'll post it up on the screen.
You're going to okay. You're going to put it up. Yes.
Yes, I'll begin with the first question that came up. So it is in two parts. I think it should be available on the screen now. Can you see?
Yes. My question will keep in mind that most listeners and watchers are students and scholars and others in academia. What possible studies on democracy can be done to try to salvage whatever remains of this concept and culture? That's a very vast ask, great ask. But I think
this is from Rimpe. Thank you very much. I mean, yes, we should think about holding some kind of ongoing forum over a couple of months and share ideas in reply to this question. I have many things to say in reply, but one is that I would say pay attention to history. History really matters in the normative and descriptive and strategic questions to do with democracy. This book, To Kill a Democracy, is in a way an historical approach to thinking about the present. And why does it do it? Because there are a few precepts, a few obvious lessons. People who are ignorant of their pasts invariably misunderstand the present and therefore underestimate or misconceive the future. The past can also provide encouragement. So the first point is, understanding what is going on now requires an understanding of the past, and therefore understanding the history of democracy is important. But the history of democracy is also populated with figures and events that are dramatic, astonishing. I've mentioned Ambedkar. In the book, there is also in the opening pages reference to Periyar Ramasamy, who was the Tamil founder of the self-respect movement. I mean, these figures bear remembering. And they bear remembering because they can teach us things about the spirit of democracy, its preconditions, its conditions of survival. I could go on, but that is one particular way in which the study of democracy can actually, when thought of historically, when looking back on it, its extraordinary history can actually help salvage its spirit and its institutions, and therefore guarantee its future. I urge you to have a look at the shortest history of democracy. It was just published last week, and I believe there will be an Indian edition of this book. And it is short, but it's one reply to that excellent question.
Thank you. I think, yes, we look forward to the Indian edition of your book. And the next question, this is from Eva. Given today's protest on hijab and the daily discussions on newer understandings of secular spaces in the Indian context, how do we form various kinds of protests against such discourses and try to keep the essence of democracy intact? You referred to what's happening in Karnataka. The Supreme Court is going to take a view, and you also said that laïcité of the French style is not what Indian secularism is. So now here we are at some sort of a crossroads where France bans the hijab. Can India do it differently? I think we are faced with a very clear alternative.
Yes, it is a very pertinent question about a very disturbing trend, as many millions of people looking on what is happening in India today suppose. And the central question of principle has to do with the Indian contribution to the whole idea of secularism. To repeat, the French model, as was pointed out by Sunil Khilnani 20 years ago, the French model is different. So the French model of laïcité, of secularism, is that a religion should be privatized, that religiosity should have no public role. It should be, its symbols and its substance should be pushed back, and matters of religiosity, of faith, should become of private concern. Of course, there are exceptions. In France, Christmas is observed in holidays, but Ramadan is not, for instance. The American model is different again. The American model, the Jeffersonian understanding of the proper relationship between religion and politics, had it that the state should be cleansed. State institutions should be cleansed of religiosity, but the society, the civil society, could, as Jefferson said, could have hundreds or thousands of faiths flourishing. So the job of government in that American model is to keep out of the affairs of believers and to respect the diversity and plurality of faith. The greatness of the India model, and I would say in my research and my thinking, I would say it is of global relevance. The greatness of the Indian conceptualization of secularity and secularism is that it was neither those two models, but to put it simply, in ideal form, it is the principle that the state, elected governments, have a duty to acknowledge that the society is multi-faith, that there are non-believers, to be sure, but there are Jains and Buddhists, and there are Hindus and Muslims, and so on, Christians. And the role of the state is to not only protect that multiplicity of faiths, to protect the plurality of beliefs in God or gods, but actually to bring about a dignification of those faiths, that is, to equalize their entitlements. That is the normative principle. I know it has been much debated in Indian scholarship and in courts of law, and of course in society. It's under tremendous pressure. But the historic significance of this, some of this principle, of which I think you should be proud, is that it introduced into the very idea of democracy that a democracy needed some shared conceptions of the transcendent, that democracy is not sustainable only on this worldly attitudes. You know, I wrote a history of democracy, a long version that surprised me because, with the exception of the French, practically every recorded case of democracy is entangled with the notion of God or gods. That is a historical fact. And what India did was remind democrats globally that functionally dependence upon some transcendent notion is quite compatible with democracy. But it also, India reminded democrats that the social foundations of a democracy are typically plural. There is not agreement among peoples of faith. And so the democratic project is one in which the protection of difference comes to be a really important norm. And that meant the abandonment of the Churchill notion, as I've mentioned, called it before, that survived heavily into the 1920s and 30s, that John Stuart Mill said it. No democracy, no parliamentary democracy could ever survive unless it had a homogeneous sense of nationhood and social identity. India has experimented now for 3/4 of a century with something more realistic, more normatively inspiring. And so the short answer to this very important question is, I mean, the revisiting of those ideals and their refurbishment in these years of the 21st century seem to me of fundamental importance. And I don't have to tell you that these ideals are under tremendous pressure at the moment. Bigotry, murder, harassment is spreading. As Pratap Mehta said, you know, one of the darkest things that is going on in India is a kind of experiment with destroying conscience, you know, a sense of conscience to do with matters of justice and dignity. The slow destruction of that is a very worrying trend. And our book is an attempt to, you know, ring an alarm bell or two about that dynamic. It's a rather too abstract answer to your question, but I hope that it's helpful.
Thank you. That's a very thought-provoking response. Do we have time for? Yes, we do have time for. This is a question from Vamsi. To reconstruct Indian democracy, isn't it necessary to have a social dialogue between upper castes and lower castes, between minorities and majorities? So part of it you have already.
Social dialogue, yes. Social entitlements and the securing of daily conditions of living as well. The point is that, to repeat, you know, a basic idea of the 1920s and 30s and into the 1940s in the last great debate about democracy and its future. And unless people in their everyday lives are protected against violence, against hunger, against indignities of various forms of verbal abuse, physical harassment, of threats of murder, unless peoples are protected socially, then democracy will be endangered, and it might well suffer democide. That is a very elementary principle. It's astonishing that I have to say it, but you know, it rather got lost in the literature globally in the last couple of decades. I'm thinking of Frank Fukuyama's, end of history story. The whole presumption that liberal democracy, American-style liberal democracy, was on the rise and globally triumphant, at least in its normative ideals. I mean, the problem I have with that, and Roy Chowdhury has with that, is that it neglects completely these social dimensions of democracy that are, indispensable conditions of its survival and its flourishing. And one last thought. I mean, I think one of the dynamics to watch globally, and India is an important player in this respect, is whether we are going to see, partly accelerated by COVID-19, whether we're going to see a rebirth of the politics of social protection. That the securing of people's lives becomes their well-being comes to be a very important principle and practical priority. The picture is very mixed at the moment. I would say that in matters of social dignity, the breakdown of caste and class relations, cities are important laboratories. Many cities represent counter trends. There are well-governed cities where there is social protection of citizens, much better than at the national level. There are other counter trends. Chile has just elected a government which is committed to these kinds of social reforms. It's what Biden is trying to do in the United States. And the opposition, which is now an anti-democratic opposition called the Republicans, does everything it can to block and destroy that kind of redistribution, that politics of redistribution. But after 40 years of what has been called neoliberalism, it seems to me that it's one of the very big issues that will decide, very big matters that will decide the fate of the spirit and substance of democracy, at least as I can see it from Sydney at well into the night.
I think we thank you for reminding us, because we don't want to abuse your generosity, and also the fact that I'm glad you brought up the linked the crisis of democracy with the crisis of neoliberalism, because it was the triumph of neoliberalism which prompted a lot of the talk of the triumph of democracy. But now I turn to, because I think we have overshot, so I'm in your hands. You have to tell us whether we can still continue to entertain questions, or whether you would like to propose a vote of thanks.
I think it's time to bring this to an end. If that's all right with everybody out here.
I think the casting vote is from Professor Keane, because he's well into the night. We are still early evening.
Well,
yes, what do you think?
You should never offer me the license of talking about democracy, because I could go all night. I think here I vote to restrain myself. And I wanted to just say to each of you, thank you very much for inspiring, generous, thoughtful, and I would say very publicly important discussion that we've had. And I'm hoping that this we can carry on doing. Unfortunately, travel to India is difficult. I think, at Barison's next Saturday night. I wish I was physically there in this wonderful bookshop, but for the time being, this will all be by Zoom. But thank you so much, and
Thank you, sir.
I hope you enjoyed reading the book, and please write some reviews, or please spread the word. As you know, the book had a rather difficult birth in India.
Yes.
And there was, ironically, an attempt to kill it. Imagine, as a number of media reports pointed out, a book with the title "To Kill a Democracy" was almost killed in India. But it survived, and it has just reprinted, and we're very thrilled about that.
Thank you so much, sir. And that was the last. The previous question was the last question. On behalf of AIRS, I am so grateful to be able to be a part of this very successful dialogic and erudite discussion. I will now propose the vote of thanks, and I am sure that you will all agree that this was a great learning experience, and hearing Dr. Keane, Dr. Arora, Dr. Ash Narain Roy, and Dr. Niranjan Sahoo speak today was quite up there. Now, the lucid arguments, the enthusiastic delivery and command of the topic, as well as the depth of knowledge, was inspiring, I should say. And I thank you all for joining us today and making this book discussion a great success. I thank the president of AIRS, Ariba Asnat, for her unfailing efforts always in the conceptualizing of this discussion and all the other discussions we've had. I would also like to thank our panelists for taking time today out of their very, very busy schedule to join us. I thank the team, Aruna, Anil Kumar, Zeba, Tamkanad, Ajab Rangunwala, and everyone else for having worked so tirelessly to make this event possible. I would like to wish you all a very great weekend. A very big thank you on behalf of AIRS and myself. And with this, I end the talk. Thank you so much, everybody. And
Thank you.
please join us. Please join us in our future talks and lectures.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Namaste.
Angela, and
Bye-bye.
thanks everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you
Bye,
very much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.